Picture this. You're standing in the golden halls of an ancient Egyptian palace, where torches cast a warm glow on painted walls. A pharaoh strides toward his throne room, his tall crown gleaming in the light. Beside him walks a young girl, adorned in a queen's attire, gold chains resting heavily on her small frame. The servants lower their heads, unable to meet her gaze. Her tiny hands tremble as she clutches her dress, her painted face masking the unease in her youthful eyes, for this new queen is not a bride from a distant land. She is the pharaoh's own 13-year-old daughter. This is one of the shadowed truths of ancient Egypt. A father who elevated his own child to a royal role to preserve his lineage. A king so focused on maintaining power that he viewed his daughter not as a child to cherish, but as a key to securing his dynasty. She was merely a young girl who should have been enjoying simple joys, not burdened with a queen's regalia and a life beyond her years. This tale may stir deep discomfort, and whenever you gaze upon images of ancient Egypt, you might recall the hidden struggles beneath its golden splendor. You'll find more stories like this in our channel, so hit that subscribe button. And now, let's dive into the story. The golden rays of Aten pierced through the limestone columns of the great temple at Akhetaten, casting long, golden shadows across the polished alabaster floor where Princess Meritaten knelt in silent devotion. At 17, she bore the unmistakable features of her royal lineage, the elongated skull, pronounced chin, and almond-shaped eyes that had become emblematic of her father's bloodline. Her hands trembled, not out of spiritual reverence, but from the crushing weight of the decision awaiting her beyond these sacred walls. "Power demands sacrifice, my daughter," Akhenaten had said the night before, his voice raspy and frail beneath the flickering oil lamps. "Sometimes we must surrender our desires to serve something greater than ourselves." But Meritaten's heart burned with a question she dared not speak aloud. If the cost of power was the surrender of one's soul, could any throne be worth claiming? In the markets, palaces, and corridors of Akhetaten, whispers carried like sand on desert winds. Pharaoh Akhenaten, the visionary who had shattered Egypt's traditional pantheon in favor of Aten, the sun disk, was dying. His bold reforms had alienated powerful foreign allies, crippled military alliances, and fractured Egypt's spiritual fabric. The priests of Amun, long displaced by his radical doctrine, waited like jackals circling a wounded lion, ready to reclaim power the moment his breath ceased. Egypt, once united under centuries of tradition, now teetered on the brink of collapse. At the eye of this storm stood Meritaten, eldest daughter of the so-called heretic king and Queen Nefertiti, raised in a palace that reverberated with divine proclamations and political unease. From her earliest years she had walked the tightrope of diplomacy and devotion, always aware that she was both symbol and strategist in her father's fragile new order. Educated not just in royal ceremony but in the machinery of governance, Meritaten had learned to navigate the complexities of court life. Queen Nefertiti had taught her to read the Amarna letters, diplomatic communications from rulers across Mesopotamia and the Levant, while Akhenaten made her a fixture in religious rituals, positioning her alongside him as a living extension of divine will. Yet none of that preparation could steel her against the burden she now faced. Egypt's future required a male heir, and Akhenaten had produced no surviving sons. Ancient precedents, grim and taboo, surfaced among the whispers of desperate advisors. Some pharaohs, in distant dynasties past, had taken their daughters as ceremonial wives to preserve dynastic legitimacy. What had once seemed unthinkable now hovered as possibility, cloaked in political necessity and spiritual justification. Meritaten stood at a precipice between filial loyalty and personal devastation. The summons came just before dawn. A servant, eyes lowered and voice tight, informed Meritaten that her father awaited her in his private chambers. There she found Pharaoh Akhenaten, a shadow of the man she had known, collapsed on his bed, breath rattling, flesh drawn tight over his elongated skull. His illness, long suspected to be wasting him from within, had accelerated. Beside the dying king stood Ai, the cunning court official whom many believed to be Nefertiti's father, as well as several high-ranking priests of Aten. "My daughter," Akhenaten rasped, eyes searching hers with desperate conviction. "Egypt stands at a crossroads. Without a clear successor, all we have built will vanish." Ai stepped forward, voice low and steady. "There is one way to secure Aten's future," he said. "But it defies natural order. It demands a sacrifice from you that only true rulers can endure." In that moment, the unspoken proposal became clear. To save the throne, Meritaten would need to enter into a ceremonial marriage with her own father, a union to legitimize a future heir. The suggestion, veiled in religious and dynastic rhetoric, echoed with unrelenting finality. For 3 sleepless days, Meritaten wrestled with the proposal's enormity. The marriage, they claimed, would be ceremonial, devoid of romantic entanglement, existing solely for political validation. Ancient texts hinted at similar unions, but none under such dire stakes. Silence weighed heavily in the palace, none more so than from her mother. Nefertiti, always a figure of poise and strength, withdrew into solitude, and Meritaten finally approached her in the Queen's garden. She found her mother gazing into a still reflection pool. The question slipped from Meritaten's lips, raw, unguarded. "What should I do?" Nefertiti, voice cracked by fatigue and grief, replied, "I've spent my reign watching your father choose duty over love. Now that choice is yours." Tears slid down her face as she added, "What you decide will shape history, and it will haunt you forever. No affirmation, no refusal, only the burden of decision passed from one woman to another." Meritaten was no longer a girl groomed in ceremony. She was now a vessel for a nation's survival, and possibly its undoing. Meritaten turned to the high priests of Aten for further counsel. Cloaked in white linen and divine rhetoric, they spoke of fate, of destiny, and the celestial will of the sun disk. Yet their reassurances felt hollow, rituals shrouded in desperation. Seeking clarity, she disguised herself and wandered the streets of Akhetaten. There, she watched artisans etching hymns to Aten on temple walls, merchants selling amulets, children playing in courtyards lit by her father's vision. These were the people who had abandoned millennia of worship to follow Akhenaten's dream. Could she now abandon them in turn, plunging Egypt into chaos by refusing her role? That night, back in the palace, she sat alone before an offering table, watching the flame of an oil lamp flicker in the still air. Could one woman bear the weight of 2,000 years of religious identity, all in the name of peace? When the sun rose on the 4th day, her resolve was set. Not out of blind obedience, but strategic necessity. She would agree, but on her terms. At sunrise, as Aten's first rays bathed the palace in gold, Meritaten presented her decision. She would accept the ceremonial marriage, but only if she retained full agency over its execution and legacy. Her aim was not merely to secure succession, but to shape a future heir who could reconcile the fractured nation. Egypt needed more than divine lineage. It needed vision, reform, and unity. While the court quietly mobilized for the controversial ceremony, Meritaten sought a confidant and found one in Smenkhare. A young noble recently arrived at court. His lineage was unclear. Some whispered he was Akhenaten's nephew, others a distant cousin. Regardless, Smenkhare exuded strength, clarity, and balance, traits Akhenaten lacked in his final days. During quiet evenings, the two walked atop the palace roof, surveying the city her father had built. "You shouldn't carry this alone," Smenkhare said softly. "There may be another path, one that preserves Aten's light without extinguishing everything else." Those late-night conversations became Meritaten's emotional lifeline, seeding ideas of a dual future that honoured both reform and tradition. Palace life drifted into a surreal state as preparations began. Courtiers averted their eyes, guards avoided conversation, and noble families found diplomatic reasons to leave Akhetaten. The ritual was treated as necessary, sacred even, but no one could mask the unease. Meritaten, meanwhile, became a student of crisis. She pored over trade records, military assessments, and diplomatic correspondence. The kingdom's vulnerabilities were clear. The Hittites advanced in the north, Thebes stirred under the Amun priesthood, and former allies questioned the legitimacy of Akhenaten's rule. Worse, internal support had eroded. Years of theological absolutism had alienated even loyal followers. Meritaten began drafting contingency plans, not just to survive the present, but to reshape Egypt's trajectory. Through this process, she gained a new perspective on her father. He was no tyrant, she realized, but a man consumed by divine obsession. She saw his regret, his quiet tears over the suffering he had caused. He had not pursued radical change for glory, but out of belief, however flawed, that Aten's truth would save Egypt. That belief now lived in her, tempered by realism. The wedding was held at noon in the great temple of Aten. As the sun reached its zenith, Meritaten stood beside her father in ceremonial regalia, the headdress of a great royal wife framing her solemn face. The open-air temple glowed with holy light, but shadows of unease crept behind the columns. Many nobles refused to attend, sending gifts instead of their presence. Akhenaten, pale and trembling, spoke the ritual vows with reverence. Meritaten followed, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. As the final blessing echoed through the columns, she felt transformed. Not in love, not in joy, but in resolve. She was no longer simply a daughter or a consort. She was now the symbolic vessel of her family's survival. That moment marked both her ascension and her entombment. Though the union achieved its political aim, momentarily stabilizing the throne, it also amplified opposition. The priesthood of Amun declared the royal family cursed. Foreign rulers, disturbed by the scandal, began severing ties. Assassins multiplied in the shadows, and Meritaten began to have visions of fire, collapse, and war. The days that followed the wedding were fraught with tension. Meritaten, now both princess and queen, pressed forward with her duties as if nothing had changed, but beneath the surface, fault lines widened. The court was split, some still loyal to Etenism, others quietly aligning with the old gods. Outside the palace, Egypt's markets slowed as trade routes withered, while provinces once loyal to the crown grew defiant. Most troubling of all were the reports from Thebes. Priests of Amanu no longer concealed their dissent. They openly labelled the marriage an abomination, declaring that the gods had withdrawn their favour from Akhenaten's bloodline. Within her own palace, whispers of betrayal reached her ears, trusted officials making discreet inquiries about alternative rulers, guards tempted by bribes, and envoys warning of shifting loyalties abroad. At night, Meritaten prayed to Aten for guidance, but received only silence, or worse, troubling visions. She saw Egypt engulfed in civil war, its cities burning, its people fleeing. Whether divine premonitions or her own guilt manifesting, she could no longer tell. What she did know was that time was running out. 6 months later, Akhenaten died quietly in his sleep. There was no mourning procession, no royal proclamation, only whispers spreading from chamber to corridor. The heretic king was gone. Meritaten, by ritual and rank, assumed the mantle of power. But her ascension was immediately contested. The council debated succession, the army hesitated, and former allies questioned her authority. Then came the second blow. She was not pregnant. The union that had cost her dignity and reputation had failed to produce the heir Egypt needed. Panic spread. Smenkheri, once her confidant, now emerged as a contender for the throne, backed by the military elite who feared a power vacuum. Even her own mother, Nefertiti, resurfaced in court politics, issuing edicts under the throne name Neferneferuetin, positioning herself as a stabilizing force. The palace became a battlefield of veiled threats and shifting alliances. Governors began declaring independence, the Hittites moved closer to Egypt's borders, and the old priesthood declared Atenism dead. Meritaten stood alone in the royal chambers once shared with her father, staring at the Aten ceiling. Everything she had sacrificed seemed to be unraveling. In the silence of those crumbling days, Meritaten questioned everything. Had she misunderstood her father's mission? Was he a prophet who saw too far ahead, or a zealot blind to consequence? Had her choices, especially the ceremonial marriage, been acts of selfless leadership or miscalculated submission? She no longer had answers. The throne had not brought power, only sorrow. Still, she remained poised, watching every faction, weighing every move. Then, unexpectedly, Smenkheri approached her, not as a rival, but as a partner. "We cannot survive divided," he told her. "If we are to save Egypt, we must rule together." His proposal was clear: a second marriage. This time not born of desperation, but strategy, a political alliance to unify the court, regain the army's confidence, and transition Egypt towards stability. Meritaten, worn by grief yet sharpened by experience, recognized the wisdom in it. Together, they could soften the harsh edges of Atenism while preserving its core ideals. It was not redemption, but it was a path forward. A second chance to lead, not as pawns of doctrine, but as architects of Egypt's future. The marriage between Meritaten and Smenkhare was quiet, almost unceremonious compared to the first. There were no great declarations, no divine proclamations, only a calculated pact between two survivors determined to salvage what remained of Egypt. Together they enacted reforms that balanced the Atenist philosophy with traditional religious practices. Temples to Amun and other ancient gods were reopened, but the core values of Akhenaten's vision, artistic realism, spiritual introspection, and the direct relationship between ruler and people remained. Provincial governors, once teetering on rebellion, returned to the fold under promises of religious tolerance and political stability. Trade routes were re-established, military alliances were reforged, and slowly the narrative shifted. Meritaten was no longer seen merely as the daughter of a heretic or a queen trapped by obligation. She became a figure of reconciliation, a sovereign who had not only endured her father's legacy but reshaped it into something livable. Her partnership with Smenkhare was not romantic, but it was functional, rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose. The palace became less a battlefield and more a place of rebuilding. Months turned into years, and eventually Meritaten conceived a child with Smenkhare. The news swept across Egypt like a divine wind. Priests interpreted it as a sign that the gods, all of them, had restored their blessing upon the land. For Meritaten, it meant something deeper. Confirmation that her second marriage, though forged under pressure, could create a legacy beyond survival. The child, when born, bore the physical features of Smenkhare, rather than the elongated skull and features typical of the Amarna line. That subtle shift became symbolic, a visual representation of Egypt's return to equilibrium, a blending of innovation and tradition. As the palace moved from Akhetaten back to Memphis, reuniting with traditional centers of power, Meritaten stood with dignity, not as a ruler who had won by force, but as one who had endured impossible choices and led through measured compromise. Her life had been marked by sacrifice and moral complexity, but now it also carried hope. Years later, Meritaten often watched her son play in the palace gardens, reflecting on the strange path that had brought her here. The girl who once knelt beneath the rays of Aten, trembling at the edge of destiny, had become a queen who brokered peace between gods, dynasties, and the fractured soul of a nation. She had never forgotten the ceremony that bound her to her father, the emotional cost, the isolation, the haunting questions. But she had learned that leadership was not purity of principle. It was the strength to act when every choice was painful. Her father's revolution had failed in its extremity, but his ideas had endured because she had tempered them. Meritaten's story became a quiet legend, taught not in triumphal hymns but in cautious lessons. She had sacrificed more than most could fathom, yet shaped a future few could have imagined. In the end, she was not simply the daughter who married her father, she was the queen who taught Egypt how to change without forgetting who it was.